for further development of Islamic traditions of thought on the relevant issues. Reasons for the optimism about this is first that Islamic philosophy and the Western tradition both have a common heritage in Greek philosophy that allows for a understanding of one another, because you can at least go back to common points in Aristotle and Plato and where we disagree with them. We also have common roots in religious beliefs. Muslims, Christians, and Jews share many basic ideas about God, creation, the afterlife, and morals. Religious thinkers in both Muslim and Christian traditions sought to provide a philosophical interpretation of their religious beliefs with the aid of philosophy. In both Western and Islamic traditions, there have also been religious thinkers who have championed philosophy and those who have considered it a kind of pollution or perversion of religious ideas. And through comparative study, we can better appreciate the types of reactions and syntheses between religion and philosophy that are possible. Consider, for example, religious ethics. Through dialogue, we can come to a better appreciation of different ways of arriving at judgments about religious ethics. In the Catholic tradition, for example, one typically seeks a general anthropology from religious texts, together with very general moral precepts, which are then applied to inform moral judgments. In the Islamic tradition, on the other hand, specific rulings or actions are sought from religious sources that may be relevant to the more general moral issues about which judgment is sought. And one then tries to find principles that will include these specific cases and the issue at hand. Aside from common roots in religion and philosophy, there are common problems that have been faced independently in our intellectual heritages. Sometimes it appears that there's no way to solve a problem except for a solution found in our own heritage. But when we compare how others have dealt with the same or similar problems, alternative solutions may suggest themselves to us. Is there a difference in the constitutive a priori principles to which appeal is made in the two traditions that allows questions to be raised in only one of these traditions but not the other? The Western philosophical tradition, as Pierre Hadot has pointed out, has also been a wisdom tradition. In the course of centuries, the Western tradition has largely lost this character, and it's been transformed into a purely academic and professional discipline. The tradition of Islamic philosophy, by contrast, is still very much a wisdom tradition, and by acquaintance with it, we can get a first-hand understanding of what the Western tradition must have been like at one time in the past. There are a number of topics that have been debated among Muslim philosophers that should be of interest to, that are of interest to Western philosophers as well. Here I'm just going to give you a list of some of the topics that come to mind without any attempt at prioritization or ranking. First, there's this issue of rationality. Alistair MacIntyre and others have argued that the Enlightenment idea that there's a single rationality for all human beings regardless of cultural heritage is mistaken. The ideas of rationality found in Islamic traditions provides an appropriate test case to examine the ways in which rationality is universal across traditions and ways in which it is tradition-bound. Panpsychism and the nature of mind. From time to time, various forms of panpsychism have been defended by philosophers in the West as well as in the Islamic world. Islamic panpsychism provides a topic through which similarities and differences in the two traditions can be compared, and subsequently the underlying concepts of mind may be better understood. Graduated existence. Since Sohravardi, Islamic philosophers have given special attention to the idea that existence is graduated. That is, that existence has various degrees of intensity, from the null point of prime matter to the absolute existence of God. In Western philosophy, on the other hand, while references to graduated existence can be found in Plato, the Neoplatonists, and others, contemporary Western philosophy has tended to treat existence as an all-or-nothing affair. At the same time, the logical apparatus for treating membership in any given set as graded has been developed in what's known as fuzzy logic, but although the possibility of fuzzy existence has been recognized by some, there's been little done to provide any philosophical motivation for it. Islamic philosophy may provide some such philosophical motivation, which in turn may be extended through other logical interpretations. Substantial motion. One of the most important doctrines of the Islamic philosophy since Mullah Sadra has been that of substantial motion. The basic idea here is that sameness of essence over time can be maintained through continuity conditions, even if the set of an object's essential properties is allowed to change. Technically, this means that the necessary and accidental properties of an object are to be considered as relative to time, so that at different times an object will have different possibilities. As with the case of fuzzy existence, Western logic can provide tools by which to model this kind of view, while the philosophical motivation for it can be found in Islamic philosophy. Knowledge by presence. The history of Islamic epistemology is characterized by various conflicting views of what is known as ilm huzuri, or knowledge by presence. And these different views can be interpreted as various forms of direct realism, and then compared with varieties of direct realism that have been defended in Western epistemology. Another issue, more religious issue, is pantheism. Pantheism has been a major issue in Western philosophy of religion, at least since Spinoza, and especially in Jacobi, Mendelssohn, Schelling, and Hegel. Issues pertaining to pantheism have been discussed at length in traditions of Islamic philosophy and mysticism that would enable a more nuanced approach to this issue, allowing for a much greater variety of positions to be distinguished. Pantheism as a term, I'll come to this after the break. We'll talk about Islamic concepts of God as they've developed in the Shiite tradition. But here I just want to mention that pantheism is mostly used as an insult. I mean, there's very, very few people that you find who actually claim and say, I'm a pantheist, you know. Mostly other people claim so-and-so's a pantheist, so his work should be disregarded or refuted or something like this. So usually pantheism doesn't really represent a school of thought to which people adhere, but rather it's a characterization used to castigate various ideas. So, for example, Hegel was called a pantheist, and Hegel responded by saying, I'm not a pantheist, you know, and don't like pantheism at all. And maybe Spinoza was supposed to be a pantheist. Hegel says that he's not sure that Spinoza was a pantheist, but even if he was, Hegel disagrees with him, and he's not a pantheist. And you find something similar happens in the Islamic tradition as well. People are called pantheists because they espouse the doctrine of Wahdat-e-Wujud, but there's all kinds of interpretations of what that can mean. Logic in the Islamic traditions has been fruitfully studied by very few Western philosophers, but Nicholas Rescher is an example of someone who's studied Islamic philosophy. Rescher claims that he learned Arabic solely for the purpose of doing research on Islamic philosophy of logic. But I saw Rescher, many years ago, maybe 25 years ago, maybe more. Anyway, when I saw him, I asked him, why didn't you continue your work in Islamic philosophy since you learned Arabic just for the sake of doing this? He said, well, I wrote a book about the topic, actually 2 books, but they didn't sell, so I started doing other things. Now, here I've mentioned a variety of topics that are discussed in Islamic philosophy that should be able to appeal to a wider audience, and in that way help people from outside the Islamic traditions to develop curiosity and interest about Islamic thought. In addition to that, there are also discussions in the Islamic sciences that deserve philosophical attention. For example, there are many discussions of theories of Quranic interpretation that should be of interest to those working on hermeneutics. There's also much in theoretical mysticism of Islam that is of philosophical interest with regard to the nature of representation, determination, creation, and emanation, the nature of the soul. And this is aside from the material in Islamic mysticism pertinent to the philosophical studies of comparative mysticism. Even Islamic law and its principles provide rich resources for comparative studies of the foundations of rights and duties, the nature of harm, and other important topics in the philosophy of law. The field of usul al-fiqh, or the principles of Islamic jurisprudence, also contains detailed analytic discussions of various kinds of speech acts, semiotics, theories of reference, and conditionals, among other topics that would be especially interesting to those who have been trained in analytic traditions of philosophy. If you have any questions, I'll entertain questions now for a few minutes, and then we'll take a short break for 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and talk about concepts of God in the Shiite traditions.
Good morning. Thank you for your lecture. My name is Axel. I just have a quick question. You've been explaining the dialogue, the exchange between philosophy in Iran, Islamic tradition, and the Western tradition. However, do you feel like the exchange is two-way, or is it still one-way, in the sense that is it still the students in Iran simply studying Western philosophy and trying to compare and contrast and learn from it, or is it an even two-way exchange?
It's by no means is it an even exchange at all.
No, it isn't. Yeah.
It's ridiculous. I mean, time and time again, we have Western philosophers coming here and saying, "Oh, you have a lot of interesting ideas, but we didn't know about that stuff." And for example, there was another conference. When was it? About 2 years ago, with a group of people again from Notre Dame University in the U.S. And one of the students here in Qom did a dissertation on the work of William Alston, who's an American philosopher of religion. And the Americans who came were just astounded that how is it that some Iranian cleric is writing about their guy, And so, he finished giving a presentation and criticism of Alston's views, and then one of these American professors got up and said, "Oh, you're talking about William Alston. He's one of our famous philosophers, He writes about philosophy of religion." And of course, everybody knew that. And then when they started trying to present their own ideas, there was a woman in the audience who teaches moral philosophy in the University of Qom. And she asked one of the speakers in the West to differentiate his view from two other American philosophers. And again, they were just astounded that these people were known. And at the same time, they have very, very little idea of what topics are being discussed and who's discussing them in the Islamic tradition. Now, there's been some, the situation is better now than it was 20 years ago, but boy, there's still a long way to go. I could give you so many examples of things like this where we had people coming from the West here and finding out that scholars here know all about Western philosophy or lots of things about Western philosophy, and they have no inkling as to what's going on. I'll just give one example. I was in Innsbruck 2 years ago, and I gave a lecture about Mullah Sadra's views about universals. And the professors who attended the university, who attended the lecture, they said, "This is completely new for us. What you're telling us about is a completely different kind of system of philosophy that we really don't know anything about." But I will say this. It used to be, if you look at books written in English about Islamic philosophy that were written before the year 2000 even, for the most part, they don't mention anything after Ibn Rushd. Mostly it goes up to Ibn Rushd, and then that's supposed to be the end of Islamic philosophy, and then people just paid attention to religion or something. They stopped thinking or whatever. And now this has changed. There's a little book that I was walking around the airport one day, and I picked up a little book on Islamic philosophy in German written by Rudolf Ulrich, who's a professor at the University of Zurich. And he had a nice discussion of the stages of Western appreciation of Islamic philosophy. And he also discussed Mullah Sadra and the school of Isfahan. And he admitted that. He said, when Westerners tried to understand Islamic thought, first, they were only interested in it in order to understand what impact Islamic philosophy had on Western medieval thought. Then came another wave characterized by works of Henry Corbin and Dr. Nass and people like this, where they were interested in exploring mysticism a little bit. And Ulrich says that it's only now that Western thinkers are starting to try to understand how Muslims viewed their own tradition of Islamic philosophy and how it developed. What were the kind of internal questions that led towards its development? Yes.
Thank you very much. I would like to take advantage of this meeting to address my previous question, my problem on your translation, Amozes Falsafah, written by Ayatollah Taqi PhD, Philosophical Instruction, about the ethical concepts. What in this book, that iktibari concept, and you translate into to be respectful terms. This is something that we discuss. Why this actually, ethical concepts are very intelligible, but when we say this iktibar or respectful ideas, it is something not clear, very clear for me or for our colleague there in Jakarta. And the second one about one issue that you said, the list of topics that may be important issue today about pantheism. There is another term, panentheism. Panentheism.
Yeah. I'll go into that after the break. When we talk about different ideas about God, I'll go into this in more detail.
Which is more compatible with Wahdatul Wujud, if someone is pantheism or panentheism?
Yeah, okay. And I'll take up the second question if you'll allow me after the break. But the first question, I should apologize about respectival or respectable. It is a terrible translation for etibari. It's kind of embarrassing. But the problem was that I didn't have anything. I couldn't find any good translation for etibari. So I thought, well, I just make something up, and use that. But I'm not satisfied with this myself either, There you go.
Yeah. Is there any interest here and around to Western philosophy beyond or besides the analytical tradition?
Oh, yes.
You mentioned Marxism, but anything else people are interested in?
Yes, lots of. Maybe I emphasize analytic philosophy too much because of my own background. I was trained mostly in analytic philosophy, but since then I've been teaching Hegel, and I found lots of students interested in working on Hegel. There's a big following of students here who are interested in Heidegger, and there's a kind of Erfani interpretation of Heidegger that's popular among students and some professors here. And there are other areas of thought as well.
Assalamu alaikum. I have got two questions. First of all, you have mentioned about some discussions between the followers of Heidegger and the followers of Karl Popper. It is interesting for me, the interest towards Karl Popper. Is it an interest towards his methodology of science, falsificationalism, or his liberal theory, his theory of the open society? And the second question is about some studies connected with Sufi mysticism and mystical practice. In this framework, I would like to ask you, as a research scholar, what is your opinion? Is there any significant difference between Sufi mysticism and Shia Irfan, or it is you view it in the framework of the same tradition but discussed in different terms and from different perspectives? Thank you.
With respect to the attraction of Popper, this was mostly associated with the debate that Dr. Sarouche had with Dr. Davari in Tehran. But Dr. Sarouche afterwards, in clarification of his own position, denied that he was a Popperian. But still, I found that most of the students in my experience who've been attracted to Popper, it's not been so much because of the open society, but more because of his deductivism. Popper tries to build a philosophy of science that's completely based on deductive reasoning. And that's what I've found has been the most attractive to students here.
Sorry, this is another question connected with your answer.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any interest in Kuhn towards maybe such theories as Kuhn's theories of scientific revolutions? Because as far as I know, Popper was very much criticized after him by other philosophers of science who just destroyed his conception of falsificationalism as not very adequate in many scientific cases.
Since I'm talking about the early developments of Iranian thought about these issues, but in more recent years, there's been significant work done in Iran on the nature of explanation, and there was a dissertation that was later published as a book and won a prize, comparing religious ideas of explanation and the theory of Lakatosh in philosophy of science. And Lakatosh is also critical in many respects of Popper and also uses some of the ideas from Thomas Kuhn's theory as well. So these ideas are now much more familiar to Iranian scholars as well. With regard to the question on Sufism, the Sufis, as they're known in the West mostly, as far as the intellectual tradition is concerned, it's the same as what we're calling Irfan, with some few exceptions. I mean, there are a few Shiite writers in this tradition who aren't studied by the Sufis, but the major Sufi writers like Attar and Molavi or Rumi, Ibn Arabi and his followers, Qawnavi, these are all people who are studied in the Iranian tradition of Irfan as well. So as far as the theoretical mysticism is concerned, there's a huge overlap in the texts that are being used. Just a minute.
Assalamu alaikum, thank you. I notice in the UK that there's been this rise of neo-Orientalism in terms of books that are being produced and ideas about the Muslim world, and this neo-Orientalist strain is also contributing towards government policy, towards the Muslim world. And some philosophers are obviously trying to counter this. For example, Fred Dallmeyer with his book Beyond Orientalism, and they are trying to reach out to the other or overcome self-other dichotomy, and open up, as he talks about, to different horizons, the meeting of horizons, etc. What I notice about Fred Dallmeyer is he's still very, he hardly refers to the Muslim tradition. He still is utilizing, ideas or traditions from Hindu and Buddhist traditions, and I feel that that there is a kind of a lack of response in the Muslim world towards, first of all, the neo-Orientalist trend, and there doesn't seem to have been a kind of an awareness of it, and also, someone like Dallmeyer is also trying to move beyond the kind of whole deconstructionist, phase as well. And I feel this isn't really being responded to by the Muslim world. There's very much this preoccupation with the Muslim tradition, but there's not really an idea of, okay, so how can we utilize this to respond to the big questions that are going on sort of in Western philosophy?
Several of Dalmayer's works, Beyond Orientalism, has been translated into Persian, and when the translation came out, there was some discussion in journals here about his views. But as far as taking it further and trying to use these kind of ideas to answer current problems, this is a general problem, I mean, even with Plantinga, there was so much interest in Plantinga when he came here, and lots of things of his were also translated. But there's very few things that have been written to try to apply the criticisms and ideas that were found to answer contemporary questions in English. I mean, we do have some people, there have been interesting discussions of people like Dalmayer and Plantinga and others in Persian language. But the Muslims who are writing in English language are usually, they haven't caught up with this dialogue, So the dialogue consists of, you find somebody writing something, either writing something in English or in Farsi that's being translated into one of the other languages, and then people react to it in that language, and then it just never takes the next step. That's a more difficult thing to achieve. You had a question?
My question is pertaining to the issue, the tendency of the Iranian philosophers and the scholars towards, analytic philosophy. And during the discussion, I think postmodernism was cornered just because of the relativity, and they were more attracted to the analytic philosophy. That was, I think, going on. So don't you think that that if Iranian scholars, they corner postmodernism just because of this that there is a relativity in postmodernism? Don't you think that there is a relativity too in analytical philosophy? Number one. Number two, whatever they do, whatever they philosophize things in many realms of the philosophy, they never incorporate the criticism that has been done by the postmodernist on the modernist, or the universality that is the integral part of the modernism. So whenever they philosophize, they undermine the criticism that is done by. So don't you think that it's a very lackness of the philosophization? Number one. Number two, it leads to a lot of implications which may not be covered later on. What is your point of view on that?
I have to be honest with you. I'm not sympathetic towards